have some discussion. The panel will have to be extremely self-disciplined, and we'll be giving you 10 minutes. The theme for this panel is Thinking Africa, and there's a question which intrigued me a little bit, which was, what does Thinking Africa think? And my scientist, my question was that actually, what's the relationship between the Thinking Africa and the Unthinking Africa in going about the future? And in other words, what social actors are we talking? I mean, are we thinking with, or thinking against, or thinking for? And that, I hope this question will appear somewhere along our discussions. In a sense, let me make a prejudice statement. I'm a social scientist in the traditional sense, and my natural instinct is to ask about the social bearers of ideas. Who are the social bearers of ideas, and what interests they pursue, what institutions are they working with, and so forth. And of course, there's always a problem, when you think of social actors and ideas, that you assign to them a historical role that comes from a kind of very theological reading of what social groups should be doing. But I do believe that, and I must confess that I felt this morning that there was something missing about the social actors who are the bearers of these ideas, and how do they live the present, and how do they organize themselves in the present for whatever project they have for the future. Now we have 5 speakers, and this very, very diverse, and I can assure you a very rich panel. I'll start with Dr. Russell and proceed. We won't go as far as Cairo, but we'll start off with Cape. And Al-Shamil Jepi from UCT in Cape Town, who's 10 minutes.
How do you put this thing on? She's on. I think you should.
Yeah, I should switch off.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'll keep my 10 minutes starting now. I just want to make, firstly, a very, very basic and simple point, is that we still work mostly within the frame of the nation state. We have to work harder at doing research that crosses national boundaries, beginning with our sub-regions and move to bigger, larger scales. Talking from the Cape, talking from South Africa, I don't know, perhaps my colleague Fred will know, if there is a history of Southern Africa, for instance. We come out with new histories of the country every now and again, but given how integrated our labor system, the liberation movements, and even before that, the slavery in my region is, we don't seem to have a history of the sub-region. I don't know, this may be the same thing for Northwest Africa, which has become of great interest to me, as you will hear later on. I'm looking for sort of relatively integrated histories at a larger scale. So we've been making, assertions about Pan-Africanism, but we seem to be doing histories very much within a national frame. If not, I'm not saying a nationalist frame, but at least in practical, pragmatic terms, within the frame of the nation state. Now, we have tremendous amount of mobility on the continent. We've had tremendous amount of mobility on the continent. And in these regions, people have moved, things have moved, ideas have moved across very large spaces. In the case that I'm interested in, which is the movement of texts, we've seen texts coming from Morocco down to as far as Kano and Nigeria for a long time, crossing east, west, north, south. And I'm keen for us to reassert this mobility and to trace this connectedness across the continent. Now, in the work that I've been doing over the last decade that have focused on textuality on the continent, I'm now at a point where I think we can say, what about philology in Africa? The notion of philology is not usually associated with Africa. When we think of philology, we think of 19th century Germany. We think of Schlegel and these people, Humboldt and others. Yet I want to say we have to make a philological move on the continent, and philology starts with reading slowly. Not thinking slowly, but reading slowly. Reading closely, reading in context, looking at the slow accumulation and composition of a text or of texts. People in literary studies may do some of this, but I think across the social sciences and humanities, we should be introducing a notion of philology, which in its most basic terms means reading slowly and looking at the history of the composition of a text. We all know that we all write, and we know how much editing and rewriting and reworking of a text goes into the production of a work, but we have not given that thought very much to our work on the continent. Both the older tradition of writing that I've been investigating on the continent since the 16th century, say, or in the contemporary period, or in the last 100 years, our philological sort of equipment and respectability to African scholarship is rather thin, I would say. So the first thing I want to say about thinking, it's dependent on how we access a text. And we need to introduce this notion of philology. And in my case, of course, it is older texts, particularly texts written in the Sahel, in the region between Morocco and northern Nigeria at the moment. But it's much bigger, it's much wider, as I've come to learn in doing this work. We've raised this issue of orally transmitted knowledge quite often in the first session. And what we see is that even orally transmitted knowledge and information also becomes texts. And these texts, these oral texts, can then be subjected to the same kind of slow reading or critique and study as what we have with originally composed or written texts. One thinks here of the studies, extensive studies done on the Sunjata epic, the multiple retellings of Sunjata, the transformation of Sunjata into novels and other types of literature. The same with Yoruba oral narratives. And of course, in contemporary times with popular culture, with rap music, etc., etc. All of this is actually knowledge that awaits philological reading, slow reading, reading in context. So this is the main issue then for me, is that we need to introduce this into our work. However, I found that it actually exists here already. That if one looks at this archive, that within the Sahel, we see that there have been philological work on the continent already. The basis of philological work is grammar. It's an understanding of grammar. It's a deep, detailed understanding of the language you're working with, number one. And what we find in the archives of Timbuktu, for instance, but not only there, are a huge number of grammar texts. These are not, these are texts not written by Arabs. So people have to learn the grammar of Arabic very well. And they proceed firstly by a critique of grammar, by a critique of words, of sentences, of language. So in terms of producing a notion of philology, it is not exactly something new to the continent. It begins, it is here, it has been done. And so that it's not at all awkward and odd to talk of philology in Africa as having a prehistory before the study of modern literature. Now, I started off by saying that, you know, one of the problems I face is looking at these broad synthetic histories as background, as somebody coming to West Africa and coming to North Africa from an essential formation in Southern Africa. And I'm looking for these handbooks that can guide me through the continent. And it's not exactly there, or things have been done in the 60s or early period, and no updated sort of general histories of large regions. I'm interested in this because texts moved and people moved, and in tracing people and texts to do philological reading, to undertake philological analysis, I also encountered the very real material. And so that, how did things move on the continent? And so, in looking at all these elements put together, literary scholars may know it, but it's not only a literary field, an issue for the literary field, narrowly conceived. It's much broader for the humanities and social sciences. And it's a notion that I have been using, which is simply a notion of textual cultures. And so that this covers both orality and the text, as in a handwritten text. So textual cultures, which has existed on this continent, we begin with philological understanding of a text, with the history of the book, of the text as a material object. Literally, what was a book made of? Paper,